basically the British wanted to control the way we thought of ourselves, because that's the easiest way to control us. Indians were always ruled by somebody else. So, Aryans gave us history, and now the British are here to give us a software update. The intellectual class after independence was dominated by people who had actually collaborated with the British.
My way or the highway.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome once again to Kitabi Baatein. I'm Abhishek, also known as Books Wale Bhaiya. My guest today is a very special person, a top Indian economist, historian, and also now the Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev sir, it's absolutely an honor to have you on Kitabi Baatein today.
Pleasure to be here.
I was looking at your profile and one thing intrigued me. So you worked as an economist. You studied economics at two very prestigious colleges, both in India and abroad. You worked at Deutsche Bank as a global strategist, and now you are with the government since past couple of years in a very esteemed position. In this career in economics, when and where did this passion for history arose?
Well, I'm a curious sort of chap, and I have an interest in history, but I'm generally curious about everything. So I'm one of those strange people who actually read scientific journals for fun, geeky as it may sound. So I have an interest in history as well, and one of the things I realized over time is that if you read history without economics and economics without history, you have probably not understood either of the two subjects. So at some point, it is important to begin. I began to read more deeply into history, and then began to find various other facets of it. But I couldn't find that information in the usual conventional books.
Right.
So I said, yeah, well, why don't I write it? Even though I have no training in the subject. But
right.
I decided to write it, and for whatever reason, became bestsellers, and I wrote a few more.
Absolutely. So it is said that Indian history writing has taken a different turn since past couple of years. We have seen emergence of new historians like you, vikramsampath, J. Sandeep, Indol, Sen Gupta. Why do you think there was a need for these new historians, a need for new narratives? What went wrong with Indian history writing that this course correction took place?
Current cycle of history writing starts with the colonial period.
Yes.
And of course, it was done with a certain slant. But basically, the British wanted to control the way we thought of ourselves, because that's the easiest way to control us.
Right.
Because if our self-image is controlled by somebody else, they can decide who we are and how we respond to various stimuli. And that's exactly what you want if you want to control a people. So they wrote history in a particular way. One of them was that, of course, Indians were always ruled by somebody else. So, you will hear, the story will give you the impression that the Mughals ruled India, then the British ruled India. The fact that there was a 70-year intervening period where the Marathas ruled India is sort of edited out. Similarly, you may be proud of your ancient history, but some white-looking people from Central Asia called Aryans came and gave you that. So at every stage, an attempt is made to show that some external party is giving you this, and you are kind of passive recipients of this. Aryans gave us history, and now the British are here to give us a software update. And we are kind of passive recipients of this whole thing. So that is something I can understand why they did. And by the way, people at that time understood that this was going on. So their alternative writings also happened. There are people like sriaurobindo, etc., or swamivivekananda, who are conscious that this is going on,
right,
and are pushing back. And it triggers others to write. Jadunathsarkar, R.C. Majumdar, etc. begin to write other ways of thinking about our history. And then we become independent. And you would think we would have freed ourselves from the colonial history. Most countries, by the way, we are not unique. Everywhere the Europeans colonized, or anywhere else colonized somebody else, they do this. So it's nothing very unique. What is unique to us is, having become independent, we did not purge the old story. Now, there are many reasons for this. One part of it is that our intellectual class after independence was dominated by people who had actually collaborated with the British. And they became, in many ways, the new elite. So people who were working in the bureaucracy, for example, now the British leave, they all get promoted up. And so on and so forth. So similar kind of things happens in our intellectual institutions. As the British leave, these are the same people. And people who had been collaborators were obviously also the ones who were most conversant in English.
Yes.
So they were also consequently. So this whole ecosystem in Delhi, particularly in Delhi as the national capital, which drove a lot of this. Remember, the states are fluid at this stage. They don't even exist in the 1950s. They're princely states, things are being merged, etc. So Delhi had a much greater ability to drive national conversations than they would say today. So they just road-rolled a certain kind of narrative through the country. Now, in that, the old collaborators, i.e. new elite, had faced one obvious problem, that they had collaborated.
Yes.
Right? So now, they found it very uncomfortable with this idea that they had been an ancient civilization and they had been treacherous. So they were very keen on this idea that there was no India before 1947.
Yes.
Okay, so for them, that is important. It may be trivial to other people, but this is important to them. And they have already an existing body of knowledge with the colonial historians have left behind, that India didn't exist, and India is just some sort of a random amalgam of warring tribes.
Right.
And somehow people from outside had given it some contours.
Britishers united India.
Britishers united India. Now, so these guys now take that on because it's important to their self-image. And so they now begin to craft a new narrative which builds rather than gets rid of the colonial story.
Right.
And it's quite, I won't take names, but most of the great historians after that. If you just do simple Google search, you will find they all came from either themselves were party to collaboration, or their immediate forebears had been part of the collaboration class.
Correct.
So they crafted this narrative that India did not exist. So they actually began to perpetuate this story, so that then they can show themselves in the light of having been just random people who happen to be working, and therefore you cannot question their motives or why they were there, because that was the first question everybody asked. Why are the direct descendants of people who signed up to the colonial system? Why are they the guys? So now they began to construct this, and of course they did it under the intellectual umbrella of leftism of various shades. So there was the Nehruvian left, the communist left, and various other kinds of left. And it suited their agenda. So that is how basically this particular lineage of history carried out. Now remember, however, there was also the other stream which had existed in British times. They also were there. R.C. Majumdar was still alive in the 50s. So they were inconvenient and they also objected. So they were pushed aside politically with the full backing of Nehru and pushed out of the conversation completely. And why did Nehru back this? After all, if you listen to his own books and his own speech, I mean, when he talks about, India as a civilization long suppressed.
Yes.
So in order to have been long suppressed, you had to exist. Right. So his own view up to that point was, yes, India was an ancient civilization, had a sense of itself. But afterwards, he also signed up to Gandhiji is the father of the nation. And that is where the starting point is. Because that suited him also.
Yes.
You see, now you can say India exists because, of one family, one father of the nation. So if there's father of the nation, you can have Chacha to the nation and so on. So that is how that new narrative came. And of course, he wanted to also show that one stream of the Congress was the entirely responsible for India becoming free. So consequently, inconvenient people like R.C. Majumdar have to be gotten rid of. And so the collaborator historians, they then latched on to this. They say, okay, we'll write you into the history and build you up in exchange for us being allowed to do the other things. So this is basically how narratives were done. I'm talking about history, but this was done across everything.
Across everything, right. And do you think they indoctrinated their theory or philosophy or outlook into schools and colleges? Because as we both agree,
Absolutely.
Historians R.C. Majumdar, Jadunathsarkar, we had thinkers like Sitaram Goelji, they did write, but they were not much takers. And this
Well,
thing became,
you have to separate out the R.C. Majumdar era from the later era. So the first lot were functioning under the British. Ironically, under British, they were able to do a fair amount of research and publish. And even in the very initial years, the 1950s. But from the 60s onwards, the system is completely cleaned up. I mean, there's almost like intellectual genocide in our universities and intellectual organizations. And nobody who wasn't hard left of some sort was left. So the debate was between whether you were Nehruvian left or Lohiite left or Marxist left, or within that where you Chinese Marxist left or you were Soviet Marxist left. Those were the debates, but there's no alternative.
Right.
So this goes on till the 80s. Some point in time in the 80s, you begin to see people like Sitaram Goel, Arun Shourie, they emerge.
Yes.
But to a large extent, they are emerging, they are a break from the previous lot. They are not a continuity. So this is a new lot that is emerging. And they are in, not only are they a minority, they're in a difficult position. They're like almost rebels.
Yes.
Right? Because the whole system is completely taken over by that time. So they actually restrict themselves to critique. Okay? So if you read most of their stuff, there is an existing establishment idea and they are critiquing it.
Yes.
That's good at one level. The downside of this is that they are not really focused on an alternative narrative.
Yes.
So they say that their narrative has these holes.
My way or the highway.
Yeah. But no, so they're basically talking about the holes in the establishment narrative, but they don't really come up with an alternative narrative. Right. And that is a big downside because in the end, one narrative is replaced by another narrative. It is not replaced by critique. You see?
Right.
So there was a limitation to that, which meant that there was no other writings. Now that has changed in this, what you described in the recent years, where other writings have come. So whether it's me or Vikram or whoever, Hindol or Sai, etc., whatever, new writings have emerged with new kinds of ideas being put forward. So that now a new set of narratives are being put forward.
Yes.
So this, in that sense, is a second break. So
yes,
there is the old nationalist writers, a break, then you have the critique phase, break, and now you have new nationalist readers.
So if we talk of this era of historians, includes you, of course, you have written some very best-selling books. Your books are very well received by the readers. Yet there's some criticism that, but he's not a proper or a trained historian, or Jason, they were not a historian.
This is a classic example of people who try to protect their turf, particularly since they don't have any argument. Who cares? Argue with my ideas.
Yes.
Yeah, tell me where in my arguments am I wrong? When I put some argument backed by some primary data,
yes,
argue why it is wrong. It's like, why is an economist writing history? Well, then I can also, why is a historian writing about economic history?
Right.
And is it the case that political history can only be written by politicians? I mean, this is a ridiculous thing. Anybody can write anything. The question is the quality good? By the way, all of knowledge is full of people, outsiders, making massive contributions outside their own field. So, economics, for example, wouldn't go anywhere without contributions from all kinds of other people, mathematicians and all kinds of other people who are not from the field. So, I think anybody who has done reasonable research and done it, and then of course you have many people say, oh, but this is not academic consensus.
Yes.
Now, I'm sorry to say, but once upon a time, the academic consensus was that the sun went around the earth.
Correct.
And once upon a time, not so long ago, the academic consensus was that all of humanity was descended from Adam and Eve. So what? All progress is based on digging past whatever the academic consensus is.
Absolutely. So coming to your book, Land of Seven Rivers, you talked about history of India's geography. How did this approach you decided to take? I mean, history of geography.
There's no... See, first thing I want to do is to break these silos. The world doesn't function in silos. It is... These boxes are created by academics for their own pedagogical reasons. So history affects geography, geography affects history, which affects economics, if economics affects politics, politics goes back and affects geography. All kinds of things happen, right? None of these things are functioning in any silo. Unfortunately, most of writing is being done in this silo, particularly of the academic kind. And I thought, why not give it a different angle?
Very true. So you mentioned a couple of important points. When we talk about Indian culture, we take a starting era as the Saraswati civilization. Though of course, more research is going on. Maybe we may come up with something, newer era wherein we can say it started. It is said that since the era of Saraswati civilization, there's a continuity of Indian culture. How do you explain this continuity and why it is significant?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that it's only 100 years ago that all these Harappan sites were found.
Yes.
Okay. Before that, we did not have any conception of this. And the idea was there were some aborigines living in India. And these white people from the north came and they colonized. These people called themselves Aryans and they colonized. And now this is a story that white people said everywhere. And in fact, this is linked in some ways to what was happening in the colonial period. Whites were going and colonizing other people. So they wanted to basically state that this was the natural state of the world. So everywhere they went, they had some similar colony. In Africa, they had something called the Hamitic invasion theory. And so on and so forth. So they always had this theory. Some lighter skinned people from somewhere came and colonized somebody else. Now they had this discovery of these Harappan sites, which are much older than what their fairly arbitrary date of 1500 BC for the Aryan invasion, which they also had, for very arbitrary reasons, come up with.
Yes.
But anyway, now what do you do? So then they said, okay, maybe these people had some sort of civilization going, but they were destroyed still by the Aryans. And there's no real link between the two. But if you go back and look at our traditional understanding of history, there is no such invasion. Our tradition, where Puranik or any other, if you go back to the Vedas, there is no mention of any such invasion. So, for example, the Vedas mention a major river called the Saraswati. Okay, it's clearly the most important geographical feature in the Vedic texts.
Correct.
It also tells us it flowed from the mountains to the ocean. It also tells us that it lay somewhere between the Yamuna and the Shutudru, which is Sutlej. Now, today there is no river of that description, but even a simple Google search will show you there is a dry river bed.
Yes.
Yes. So, is it too much of a stretch to say that this must be the Saraswati? Especially when the Mahabharata clearly states that this river was drying up at the time of the Mahabharata. So we have a river where you need to be. It is dry, but the drying up is also discussed. And importantly, there are a large number of Harappan sites along it. So it must have been of some cultural, urban, political importance.
Right.
So it all fits together to state that, look, this thing must be of some importance in our history and must correlate to the Vedas in some fashion, since the Vedas also mentions this river being very important and that, very important tribe called the Bharatas live on its banks and so on and so forth. So this is an obvious thing, right? Now, if it doesn't fit all these other old colonial era descriptions, then what can I do?
Right.
I mean, if you just went with the primary evidence and took common sense points, this fits. Now, I don't care what the academic consensus is. Academic consensus is maybe clearly wrong. In any case, it's based on something arbitrary.
Yes.
I mean, if you ask any historian, why did the Aryan invasion happen in 1500 BC? Why not 500 years earlier or later? They will not be able to explain it to you.
Right.
And by the way, all the advantages that the Aryans were supposed to have against the local Aborigines is all arbitrary. They evidently, they had iron weapons against the Harappans who had bronze weapons. Well, it turns out that iron, systematically used, first time in the world, happens in India, in southern India, in fact, and then moves to the Gangetic Plains. So it was an Indian technology, first of all. Similarly, the earliest chariot known that has been dug up anywhere in the world is in India. It's in Sanauli, in Bagpat, not far. It's in the Gangetic Plains, not even in the northwest. It's in the Gangetic Plains. And just use common sense. Let's say there were all these people in Kazakhstan on chariots. Let's say such things were there. If you tried to come to India on these chariots, let me assure you, you would have abandoned them in the Hindu Kush.
Of course.
Okay, just try going over the Hindu Kush on your chariots and then try to fight any battles that you want to do in Punjab with all those rivers and the loamy soil. So, chariots are useful in Kazakhstan and they are useful in Haryana, West UP. They are not even very useful in Bengal. So they're only, people think that chariots are useful battle equipment anywhere and every. No, it requires absolute flat land which doesn't have too much, rivers and other obstacles.
Correct.
It's only, and it's dry. If it's very forested also, it's useless.
Absolutely. So in this Saraswati civilization, we often link it to the Hindu civilization. But again, there are historians who say that this Vedic civilization or Rig Vedic people have nothing to do with the Saraswati civilization or Indus Valley civilization. In fact, they also, express their doubts on a Hindu civilization, whether it existed or
not. So
they
first of all, they start with the thing that there's no such thing as Hindu only. I mean, come on. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, we clearly have a continuous lineage going back all the way. How can you simply deny that we exist?
Yes. When there is strong evidence.
Yes, we exist. I mean, the fact of the matter is the oldest extant, text in the world is the Rig Veda. Even by their reckoning. And, millions of Hindus are using the Rig Vedic chant of Gayatri Mantra and so on a daily basis.
Correct.
So how can you say that we have no link to those people?
Absolutely. But these are unfortunate narratives that have been fed.
Yeah.
So coming to the second ocean of churn, you talked about King Ashoka and you have a very different view from what is the generally held view. So when Ashoka is the king looked as a peacemaker, but you get different reasons. So what's your take on that?
So first of all, I want to point out that whatever I'm saying is based on exactly the same evidence that the conventional thought that Ashoka was a great king and a pacifist and that he became a Buddhist because of his repentance against the after the war in Kalinga. Yes. The evidence for this story is extremely thin. And if you don't believe me, read the evidence yourself because there's very little of it. There are a bunch of edicts which all of you can read. It will take you no more than a few, 1 hour to read all the edicts. There are not that many. And then there are a few other documents, mostly not from India, like Ashoka Vadana, which is a Buddhist text from Sri Lanka, and a few others. So it's 1 day's work to go through all the evidence there is on Ashoka. The rest of it is actually mostly made up.
Okay.
So now it's not like Romila Thapar was having breakfast with Ashoka every day. She has the same evidence. I have the same evidence. Okay. If you do this little bit of 1 or 2 days of research, you will also have the same evidence. Now you make up your mind. I'll tell you what. I have used the same evidence to come to the following thing. It is very clear that he was a Buddhist before the Kalinga war. That is very clear. There is an inscription clearly describing this.
Very true.
There is no traditional document, not even the Ashoka Vadana, no Buddhist document mentions that Ashoka became a pacifist or a Buddhist because of the Kalinga war. Okay, nowhere.
Correct.
Okay, the inscription clearly states that he was already a Buddhist at the time of the Kalinga war.
Yes.
So first of all, this entire story that he became a Buddhist out of repentance is basically bullshit. Because the evidence is entirely the other way, number one. Secondly, the idea that he then became a pacifist is also kind of shaky. Because, yes, he does have a passage where he states that I am feeling sorry for having invaded Kalinga and carried all these massacres. But then, first of all, he doesn't say that he's shutting down the army and all that.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And even this repentance is not in Kalinga. If he was really, feeling sorry about it, the bunch of people to tell it to the Kalingans. So all his inscriptions, none of his inscriptions in Kalinga mention any repentance. This repentance is mentioned in an inscription far away in what is now Pakistan. And even in there, when he mentions, yes, I'm feeling bad about this, the next set of inscriptions, basically, next few lines basically says, however, notwithstanding the fact that I'm feeling sorry for what I did in Kalinga, if you forest tribes behave badly, I will do the same thing to you. So this is more like a threat.
Correct. So I think another attempt just to showcase that, Jainism, Buddhism, they arose because of the issues within Hinduism out of the caste discrimination. That's why you saw emergence of
frankly,
Buddhism,
you can read the original writings of the earliest texts of Buddha. There is no such see, this is all derived out of the colonial idea which the British had, that Buddhism was some sort of a Protestant Hinduism.
Yes.
Okay. Now that is their experience. Right? That's not our experience.
Not our experience. The power of narratives, that is
yes.
what basically is. So in your book on your latest book on India's freedoms and revolutionaries, you brought forward a very important point, because whatever has been written about revolutionaries, unfortunately not much. Revolutionaries are looked at in isolation. So there was one revolution here, one revolution there. You brought forward this point. Unfortunately, it took 75 years of independence to come with such a book. These revolutionaries did not work in isolation, it formed a very cohesive unit. So if you can elaborate a little on that.
So as I told you right in the beginning, when the storytelling was going on in the 50s and 60s, and there was an attempt to obviously write the correct history of the freedom struggle. Many of the people were still alive. R.C. Majumdar was given the job of writing this, but unfortunately found that he was not being adequately accommodative of the Nehruvian view, which basically extolled the importance of one branch of the Congress, not even just of the Congress, but one branch of the Congress. Now, what happens is you cannot entirely delete out the memory of these other people. I mean, people knew Subhash Bose, they knew people like Chandrasekhar Azad, Bismil, Raj Bihari Bose, etc. There were people had known them in recent times. So I think what they did is very clever. I mean, you have to grant it the amount of thought that is. They basically sliced them up and mentioned them in passing along the way, giving deliberately the impression that these were random acts of rebellion and had no coherence, and that it had no impact on the final outcome. So they look at how I have to grant it, whoever did it had a great amount of insight into understanding narrative building.
Right.
They first of all deleted out of public memory certain critical events that would have provided the connections. So many people will not have heard of the Gadar movement, which was a massive movement. You would not have heard about the naval revolt, again a very major event. If you read the newspapers from that time, that's all front pages are full of all of this. Okay, so they deleted out a few critical moments out of the story. Then they converted these into heroic stories of individuals. Now, it also fed into what the left wanted. You have to remember that the communists had actually played almost no role in our freedom struggle. In fact, they had collaborated with the British during the Second World War and, in fact, actively mocked and worked against Subhash Bose, whom they used to call Tojo's running dog and all this kind of thing. So they arrived at independence with have no record of having participated in the freedom struggle. Now you become free. Now they are now becoming part of the history writing and all of this. So they have to create a lineage for themselves. All of this is about lineage building.
Yes.
So just like Nehru was building a lineage for his welfarist ideas by promoting Ashoka, the communists decided to create one by adopting Bhagat Singh. Okay.
Yes.
Now there is a great amount of inconvenience here because first of all, Bhagat Singh in his own writings like Why I Am an Atheist, etc. mentions that he is an individual who is stuck in a non-communist movement. That's the whole point about Why I Am an Atheist, is that he's describing that I am the only guy here who is a communist, nobody else is. So first of all, Bhagat Singh was not a part of a communist movement. They were actively, in fact, many of the founders like Sachin Sanyal, etc., were actively anti-communist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, so they adopt him. But that requires that you do not, you kind of play down Rajguru and Thapar. Now, Sukhdev, Thapar, Rajguru and Bhagat Singh were hanged at the same moment for exactly the same act.
Correct.
Right? But you see, you have to delete. So there's nobody in this country who would not know the name of Bhagat Singh. But Rajguru and Sukhdev Thapar, many people will not know. But they're actually equal. In fact, Sukhdev Thapar was more senior to Bhagat Singh in the scheme of things. But you see, because Rajguru, for example, would be very inconveniently considered today a Hindu nationalist. So usko quietly hata do.
Yes.
Emphasis even with Bhagat Singh is not on the Saunders assassination, which is a revenge for Lala Lajpat Rai's killing, but on the throwing of the bomb in the parliament, for which he was not hanged. That is actually, he was jailed for it, not hanged for it, because his collaborator in that was not hanged. Okay, so you have muddied the whole thing. And then you have Bhagat Singh is then brought out. So you now bring out Bhagat Singh, decontextualize him, pull him out, and then create a lineage to him for the communist movement.
Right.
You see, so all of this was going on.
Hijacking of history.
Hijacking of history, how you tell the story.
Right.
So then similarly, Netaji is turned into, first of all, either he is diminished in some fashion, where he can be.
Yes.
Where he can't be, he is seen as some sort of a left-wing icon. Yes, he did have links to the left and so on, but he was hardly a leftist. I mean, really, the movement from which he comes out is, he's a disciple of Chittaranjan Das. So if you read Chittaranjan Das, then you will understand.
But the Royal
by the way,
which he led was also not much talked about earlier.
Yeah, and Netaji was an extremely religious man,
yes,
as it happens to be. I mean, his first time he did this hunger strike was in order to force Durga Puja to be celebrated in Mandalay. And throughout his life, even towards the end when he was in Singapore, every day he would go to the Ramakrishna Mission for doing the meditation and arti. Every day. So I'm just telling you that these are all quietly held out. And so you have these random individuals, random events, and then so the story of the overall movement cannot be told. But the moment you tell the whole overall story, it has a very different connotation. Yes. Suddenly, Sriaurobindo goes from being, some hermit in Pondicherry to becoming this rabble-rousing revolutionary. Savarkar suddenly pops up. And Sachindranath Sanyal, very, very religious man.
Yes.
And he is the guru of all these people, including Bhagat Singh, but also Chandrasekhar Azad, Bismil, Ashfaqullah Khan. All of these people would today have been simply dismissed as Hindu nationalists.
Absolutely. So in the Gadar party revolution, Gadar was a weekly which they issued, the sort of revolution. If you can tell a bit more about that, and I think your own great granduncle Sachindranath Sanyalji was a part of the Gadar movement, the Gadar Pride.
Yes, so the Gadar was actually an attempt in the years in the First World War to cause a rebellion in the British Indian Army. So it's like a precursor to the INA.
Right.
And it had various leaders. In India, it was Raj Bihari Bose and Sachindranath Sanyal. Sachin Sanyal is my granduncle. But they had many others as well. There was Bhaga Jatin. In fact, my great-grandfather from my maternal side also was a part of this movement.
Oh, okay.
So there were many others. Naninaksha Sanyal is my mother's side. They also have the same surname, although they are not related. So there are many characters in this story. Now, the Gadar movement also had a international wing, important part of which functioned out of California and British Columbia. And there was a person there called Lala Hardayal,
yes,
who used to issue this newspaper called the Gadar. And so what happened is that the British knew that this was going on, and they began to infiltrate the Gurudwaras in order to try and capture them. Now, the nationalist Sikhs knew what was going on, so they began to shoot these fellows, these British collaborator types. So, there was several shootouts. Ultimately, what happens is, there are shootouts both ways. And there's one shootout in which Bela Singh, who was one of the collaborators of a British agent called Hopkinson, he shoots 2 people dead in Gurudwara. So what happens is that there is a court case, and everybody knows that he's going to be left because he is backed by the British state. So he goes in there, one of the Gadarites stands up, whips out a revolver and shoots Hopkinson dead in that court case. So this is all what is going on.
Yes.
So these are the kinds of events. But despite the shooting of Hopkinson, of course, America entered the war on the British side, and then they instituted something called the Hindu-German conspiracy case. So many of these Gadarites were captured and so on. And so these Gurudwaras were ultimately ended up in the control of these collaborators. And they again had the same problem which our Indian intellectuals had. They did not want to be seen as collaborators, naturally. They were traitors.
Yes.
So they also began to buy into this idea of a separate Sikh identity from the Hindu identity. They began to invest into some sort of separatist kind of thinking. And you can see where it is coming from. It is coming from this entire infiltration and support for this, what I would call loyalist Sikhs, right. Collaborator Sikhs. And so that remains. So the Khalistani movement's original founder is a British agent called Hopkinson.
So, as I read in the Revolutionaries, you talked about these freedom fighters. But would you say that the history of Indian freedom struggle is in some way also a story of these traitors? And because there are lot many people who betrayed us.
So, if you do not understand these traitors, you do not understand Indian history at all. How it was written and how it was told.
Right.
One of the people who we know was a British informer was this Hindi writer called Yashpal. And we have lots of evidence now. But after independence, and by the way, even at that time, in the 1930s, people suspected him. In fact, Chandrasekhar Azad was killed based on information from Yashpal. But Chandrasekhar Azad, a day before he was killed, had actually ordered Yashpal to be hunted down.
Okay.
And so, the British, in fact, orchestrated an arrest where they acted like they were arresting because they didn't want, they wanted to throw the revolutionaries off scent. And then they put him in Bareilly jail. In Bareilly jail, he was allowed to get married and keep his wife with him. Now you tell me, in an era where revolutionaries were basically sent to Kala Pani or they were hanged or beaten to death or something like that, here is a chap who is kept in Bareilly jail in the sort of VIP treatment with he got married in jail, lived with his wife in jail. How is that possible? It is possible because he was in jail not because of what he did against the British, but because he was being protected from being hunted down by the revolutionaries.
Yes. And I think he also got some literature awards.
After independence, he then made a name for himself, writing all kinds of things about his adventures as a revolutionary. Whereas, in fact, he was the informer. So it happened that somewhere in the late 60s, there was a CID official called Dharmendra Gaur, who was in Lucknow, and he discovered by chance a bunch of letters between various pre-independence officials.
Okay.
Where they mentioned that, there was this guy called Yashpal who is giving us information. We need to make arrangements for him that now that we are leaving, we should make arrangements for him. So he then wrote a book and published it also.
Yes. Yes, I mean, it is not that dawn, and many books are to his credit as well, and then he got published. But anyway, he got the
So he got exposed, but before he got exposed, he won all these awards.
Yes. So definitely it's a history of betrayals, and as you mentioned that, after the killings in Amritsar, Jallianwala Bagh, General Dyer was bestowed with some honor by the Sikhs themselves after that brutal massacre, which is ironical, but unfortunately this is how history was. So in this book you also mentioned about the love story of Ulhaskar and Leela, the freedom fighter, and so if you can elaborate a little on that.
So Ulaskar Dutt was one of the original members of the Anushilan Samiti. He was their key bomb maker. He's arrested, he nearly gets hanged, but anyway, he gets shipped off to Kalapani. But in the days before his arrest, he was in love with Bipin Pal. Remember Lal Bal Pal?
Lal Bal Patel.
So the Pal of that, his daughter, called Leela. And so they were in love. They were classmates, I think. And anyway, they were planning to get married. So now, of course, he gets captured, sent off to jail. And it's a life sentence. And while he's there, there's not much information. But anyway, he spent some time there. And at some point in time, he begins to push back. I mean, they are obviously torturing them, making them doing all kinds of work. So at some point, he just stands up and says, I will not do whatever these things you are forcing us to do. And so he gets very badly beaten up. And then he begins to run a very high fever. But these guys, they don't let up. He's really bad, high fever, 106, 107 fever. In the middle of that thing, they then electrocute him. In fact, there's one of the first known uses of an electric battery.
Okay,
was to give electrocution to Ulaskar Dutt. And through it all, he loses his mind because he's under this immense pressure. The only thing that sort of keeps him going is this image of Leela that he keeps screaming her name. So anyway, he goes completely mad. He loses his mind and etc. So ultimately, there is a huge strike because he's screaming, right? And they can hear him across the cellular jail complex. So, if I'm not mistaken, it was Savarkar who then did a hunger strike, etc. And eventually, there was a pushback. And as a result of that pushback, the authorities decided to send him off to Madras, to a mental asylum there. So then he would spend many, many years there recovering. And through all this haziness, he still remembers Leela, right? Now, meanwhile, Leela has not heard from him. So she doesn't know what's happened to this guy. So she at some point gets married and moves to Mumbai. So by the time many, many years have passed, more than a decade have passed, Ulaskar finally comes back, sort of normal. He's released from jail and he goes looking for her. But he discovers that she's married. Yeah. So, well, she's married. So he begins to do other things. He goes back to some other revolutionary activities, etc. And at the time of independence, i.e. partition, he's back in his village in East Bengal. And so what happens is that, of course, he's kicked out of his house. He runs, escapes, comes into India. Then somebody tells him that Leela is a widow and she's also paralyzed waist down. So he hunts her down in Mumbai, brings her back to India, back to Bengal, but not to this side, but to the other side, actually to Silchar, what is now in Assam. So there he marries her. So he eventually does marry her and looks after her through the last years of her life.
That is indeed one of the most fascinating love stories, and yeah, it's true. So, one last question: you wrote a book of short stories, "Life or Two Other Stories." How did that idea came in, and why you haven't written more short stories?
Well, my writing story partly started with writing some random short stories one afternoon many years ago while I was living in Singapore. And in fact, I began writing books partly because I was trying to publish them, but I couldn't, and nobody would publish it. So I had kept adding more. But meanwhile, I published all these other books which became bestsellers. So finally, the publisher agreed to publish short stories because the general view in the publishing industry is the short stories don't sell.
Yes, correct.
So maybe just to kind of please me or whatever, they published this. It also turned out to be a bestseller. That's a different matter. But when I wrote them, nobody was keen on publishing them.
And that's the reason you are not writing further.
No. It requires sitting down and writing.
Of course.
And I
remember in the book you mentioned you want to kind of revive the tradition of short story writing in
genre.
India. So.
Yeah, and satire writing.
writing. Absolutely. Great. It was wonderful talking to you, sir. I think it's one of the most illuminating sessions I ever had. Learned so much about history. Thank you very much for your time today. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Right.
Thank you,
Bye.
sir. Thank you.